3 hype books, 1 hidden gem, timestamps below, let's go. What does Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb have in common with Stoner by John Williams, you ask? Okay, maybe you didn't ask, but I'm going to get to comparisons here in a minute anyway. But before I go on about Fool's Errand and about those comparisons, I want to direct you to 2 videos in case you're new here. One is if you've never read The Realm of the Elderlings or Robin Hobb, I have a video comparing the books so far in The Realm of the Elderlings that I've read, which is the Farseer trilogy and the Lifeship Traders trilogy. And if you have read The Realm of the Elderlings and if you've read Fool's Errand, then please check out my vlog. I have a spoiler-filled vlog of Fool's Errand and my reading experience. It was my first ever spoiler-filled reading vlog, and I am quite proud of that video. It's interesting here on BookTube, and not to get meta here, but it is interesting how I accidentally saw in my YouTube Studio app, because I try to avoid analytics on YouTube, how I saw that video was 10 out of 10, the worst video you've done in a long time. And yet the comments on that video have been so beautiful and meaningful to me. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart if you watched that vlog. But getting into the book now in a spoiler-free way for the purposes of this wrap-up, I will go ahead and share here that this story did take an adjustment for me. It did take an adjustment for me to get into first-person narration in Fitz's perspective, because I had just recently come off the Lifeship Traders trilogy and I got so used to Robin Hobb's third-person multi-POV narration. So when I got to chapter 2 in this book, I thought, oh, we are still in Fitz's head. And so it was a little bit of an adjustment, but I quickly found myself connecting to this story. And the thing is about this book is how emotional it is. It is a book that was extremely hyped for me, and I found it lived up to the hype, despite the fact that I did have an idea of something that happens in this book. I knew where the story was going. I think unlike some readers, I did know of a certain event that would take place, but it did not in any way diminish how I felt about the book. In fact, the first half of the book seeped into me little by little in the most beautiful, slow burn way. I felt so connected to the character of Fitz. And the thing is, in the first half of the book, nothing happens. Almost nothing happens. There's one incident that's a little dramatic, but for the most part, we're in the same location. Not much movement happens. No great mission is at place. That doesn't happen until the second half of the book. And yet I felt a well of emotion. And the thing about this book, and the reason I bring up Stoner by John Williams, is because I thought about it after I finished the book and after I finished the reading vlog. I thought about it and I thought about how it was making me feel, the stirring of emotions, and how much depth I felt for this character who, when you read about this character of Fitz, I felt this whole depth of emotion that the character is not even aware of. It's as though Robin Hobb is able to capture the interiority of this character without blatantly telling you that how the character feels, without the character realizing how he's numbed himself to this greater inner turmoil, this greater depth. But you get that sense of it through the subtext and the dynamics with other characters, with the interaction with other characters, with the emotional interplay, the subtle and emotional interplay with other characters. And I thought it was so profound, and it reminded me so much of my reading experience of Stoner at that point when I processed that some more. Because when I was reading Stoner, I feel like John Williams in that book is able to convey the depth of loneliness and of struggle, of inner turmoil in a character without the character fully allowing himself to tap into it 100%. It's like he's keeping himself a bit distanced from it. And at the same time, another thing that these 2 books have in common, or these 2 characters have in common, I should say, not that these stories are comp titles for one another, not by any means, but I feel as though both characters also have aspects that were uncomfortable to read about. I did struggle with Fitz. I did struggle with this character in the second half of the book. And I also had some struggles with Stoner too. But I think it's that contradictory nature that makes characters come alive and make them more three-dimensional. And so I feel like this book was a masterpiece for how it conveyed that. For me, it gave me exactly what I look for in literary fiction, but in a fantasy book. And the themes shine through so effortlessly. I feel like a broken record talking about how Robin Hobb relies on show, don't tell for the most part. I mean, there is exposition, there is some telling of things, but when it comes to the emotional human experience. I feel like so much of it is conveyed through the dynamics of characters, again, through the dialogue, through the subtleties of subtext. And I feel like it's brilliant the way that that's portrayed. And I actually have a whole entire theme recap that I displayed on the screen at the end of my vlog, though I think there are probably a couple of other themes I could have touched on more. I don't want to say anything more than I've said in that vlog, but again, if you watched the vlog, thank you so much. And if you want even more spoiler-filled conversation about this book, I had a wonderful conversation with Derry over on her channel that you could check out. Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinniman might be the most positive I felt about a book that wasn't for me. This is a book following 27-year-old Coast Guard veteran Carl, and he is living in an apartment with his ex-girlfriend's Persian show cat, Princess Donut. And during a blizzard one night, there is a situation that leads them into this underground multi-level dungeon, fighting to survive in what appears to be a battle royale / Hunger Games situation. And it also happens to be mixed up with an intergalactic game show. And I think part of the charm of this book is the relationship between Carl and Donut. Carl himself has some surprising depth of character, but Donut, for me, was the standout character. I loved this cat. When I was reading it, I'd look over at my cat and thought, yes, this is you. I feel like Dinniman is totally channeling a cat, even though my cat's not a Persian show cat. The other thing is the humor. Now, not all the jokes landed for me, but I did find myself laughing out loud quite a few times. There is more salacious humor than I was expecting in this story, very crass. And I also appreciated the opening of the book. I think right away we get an interesting internal conflict with Carl. Yeah, I guess those are the positives I would say about the book, is that I loved the characters. I think that the initial setup was really interesting. It had a lot going for it as far as that's concerned. It's littered with pop culture references. But that said, this wasn't quite for me. It was in moments. Like I said, in moments, I was surprised how I laughed and had a good time. But it wasn't for me in that it is so fast-paced and action-packed. It's quite bombastic in its action sequences, and I just find myself zoning out when it comes to that and all the lit RPG elements. This is lit RPG, by the way. So we get references to looting and treasures and rewards and stats, and none of those things quite appeal to me personally, even when I'm playing a video game that has RPG elements, as I do sometimes with my husband. I let my husband take care of all of the data and numeric stuff and all the perks and leveling up aspects of the story, and I just focus on the gameplay itself. That's more my interest. So I knew lit RPG was a stretch for me. I had a feeling this might not be for me, but I wanted to give it a shot because I had heard from friends who are not fans of lit RPG that they enjoyed this book, that they enjoyed this series. And my husband picked it up and he is loving it so far. He's already in book 4, having a great time. He did tell me that he felt like book 1 was the strongest so far. And he did warn me that the plot does get more and more convoluted as you go along. And that's also just not my thing. I can appreciate a good plot, as I always say, but it's not necessarily the number one reason I pick up a book. So, I mean, this was a stretch for me, but the more I looked back on it, the more I think, I think Dinniman did something very creative here, and I think his dialogue was rather well written. While I won't be continuing on, I can see the appeal. I can understand why it's so popular, and I'll just accept being one of the few who appreciates it for what it is, but is not going to continue. No Life Forsaken by Steven Erikson is book 2 in the Witness series. This is following the first book, The God Is Not Willing, and it takes place after Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, I am not somebody who usually jumps on new releases, in case you haven't noticed, but I did read The God Is Not Willing when it was released, and that was around the time when I met Steven Erikson in person. And with this book, I did want to get to it, but it's been so challenging because so many of my friends here on BookTube have read it, and I've been trying to be careful about not watching any reviews or in-depth reviews about this book yet until I get my own thoughts out there so I don't accidentally get influenced by what other people think, though I do enjoy doing that too. And I'm going to be doing that on Alan's channel because we're going to be having a wonderful spoiler-filled discussion about this. But I wanted to get my fresh thoughts out before going into that discussion, though this video might come out after that video on Alan's channel, but please check that out if you're into this series. First thing I'll say is that there is a vivid cast of characters in No Life Forsaken, and that there is no crossover between the characters here and the characters in the first book, The God Is Not Willing, and there is an all-male love triangle in this book. I always look out for love triangles because I love how people say they hate love triangles, but it did play a special role, I think, in the storyline. And I want to first get into the prologue of this book. So in the prologue, you will notice several familiar characters from Malazan Book of the Fallen, if you've read that series. And there is one of the most meta quotes I've ever come across in fiction in that prologue. It says here, "This is about beginnings. In fact, the whole thing is about beginnings. Oh, I won't leave them all hanging. I'm not quite that cruel, despite opinions to the contrary. A few proper endings, I promise, enough to satisfy. Well, not everyone, no matter. The longer you live, the more faded this thing we call optimism." Stephen Erikson, I am more optimistic than you are. I will say this right away. If the next book in this series were published or put out tomorrow, I would jump on it immediately. That's how that should say a lot there. But first, to give you some context, of course, I don't want to go into spoilers at all, but we are in the prologue dealing with some characters that you will recognize from the 10-book series. It's a frame narrative in which they're discussing the events that take place in this novel that involve a certain elder god getting involved in what is indirectly related to Karsa Orlong. Karsa is not in this series, but he's looming large in this series. That's not a spoiler to say, I don't think. And then we go into the story. And the story largely takes place in a city called Gdanispan in the Seven Cities region. And there is this whole underquarter subterranean set of mazed streets and sunken houses. And there's this crime organization that's taking place there. And we additionally have cultists, a goddess reborn, this rebellion that might be on the horizon, an apocalypse that might be on the horizon, and then Malazans who are trying to keep things in order with freedom of faith. And so we're largely dealing with religious themes, the theme of faith. And I would say in addition to faith and the mystery of that, and there's this wonderful epigraph that talks about faith and trust and mystery and humility. But additionally, there is this exploration of division, whether that division comes from religion itself or whether that division comes from empiricism. And not only about looking outward at division in the world, but also looking at the division within each individual and how a soul can be divided and the rage and the anger that might be fueling the soul for that division to ensue. And so there's like a message of responsibility. I feel like the theme seemed a little didactic for Malazan and maybe a little more overt than I'm used to seeing in the series. But that said, there's probably still a lot to unpack even within that. And it does feel like it's the first half of the story as given away by that epigraph quote. And I did agree with that epigraph in the sense that I felt like there was enough that concluded in this book to feel satisfying at the end. And yet, like I said, I feel like I want to get to the next book already. And I know that that one has already been sent to the publishers and that we'll see when that comes out, I guess at this point. It's already been written. That's what I understand from watching a certain interview with Stephen Erikson recently. The book kept me engaged from beginning to end. Several vivid characters, as I mentioned. Fedalap, a sapper, might be my favorite in the book. Several amazing female characters, by the way, but too many that start with the letter S, and it got confusing for me after a while. It was a good time. It didn't quite reach the same highs as other Malazan books, as the 10-book series for me personally. One more thing I'll say is that there was an epigraph in this book. I love the epigraphs in Malazan, but there was an epigraph in this book that made me feel so seen. It was about the ability to look at the desert and see the beauty in it and the role of imagination. And I loved that so much as somebody who grew up in the desert and had many friends who would come to the desert and just see dirt and complain about it. And for me, I saw so much color, so much variation. So that epigraph just spoke to my soul. I loved it so much. So those are my thoughts for now. Looking forward to catching up with the others and watching all the reviews now that I have my thoughts out there. Now for an underrated hidden gem, and that is The Silver Metal Lover by Tanith Lee. I have read Tanith Lee before. I've read Electric Forest, which is my favorite by her so far. Night's Master, which is book 1 in the Flat Earth Tales of the Flat Earth series. And I'm currently reading Death's Master, which is book 2 in that series. Have I read anything else by Tanith Lee? I guess that's about it. But I did pick this up, and I almost DNF'd it several times in the first half because it had what I would describe as whiny, teenage, privileged, histrionic characters. We're following a young girl named Jane, a 16 or 17-year-old girl, and she is ridiculously, unfathomably rich. She lives in this tower that goes up above the clouds. She lives with her mother. Her mother is quite the head case and is very controlling of Jane. She has Jane take certain drugs in order to control Jane's body. Venus Medius is what she calls herself. So to have a certain amount of curves, I suppose, to make her hair a certain color. And Jane is so sheltered that she always goes to her mother for advice, and she doesn't trust herself. She only has 6 friends, and they're all super rich and privileged as well, and caught up in their own thing. They're all very self-absorbed. And at this time in the future, the backstory of what's going on the planet is that an asteroid got very close to hitting Earth, but as it got closer to Earth, much of it burned away. The moon's gravitational pull got it off track and stabilized it, so it's hovering like a blue-green star near the planet. But because of the instance of tsunamis and earthquakes that it brought as a result of getting so close to Earth, it took out 1/3 of the population, mostly of Western Europe, and caused the United States to branch off into 72 islands or something like that. That's just more like the backstory, but this is also a time in the future when robotics are prominent in society, and there are these humanoid robots that look so convincingly human and act so convincingly human, with the exception of their skin, which is silver. And so our character Jane one day encounters a robot that is of the silver model. He is a musician, he plays the guitar and sings, and she doesn't know how to process this. She doesn't know how to process a robot being so man-like, to be so seemingly human and not human. And yet, because he's a robot, he's hired out for pleasure. He's hired out for either sexual pleasure or for entertainment, and he is programmed to be happy, making people happy. And so she tries to find a way to get him to be hers. And he gives her the warning. He's very gentle with her, but he gives her the warning. He said, you can't expect me to be human, because I'm not. I'll never be able to be human like you truly desire. And the story goes in a direction I did not expect. I had one idea in mind. It went a totally different direction, and I loved it. I cannot believe how much I loved this book. I feel like the interesting thing about it too is that it goes into programming, because obviously robots are programmed to do things, but Jane herself, in some ways, because of her relationship with her mom, has a certain kind of programming, if you want to call it that, or a certain kind of conditioning. And Silver, the robot, he helps her to see through those patterns and see through her fears and make different choices. So they influence each other along the way. I don't want to give away too much, but there is just a beautiful love story that emerges out of this. But in some ways, this was very much relevant to what's going on now, in the sense that there's a lot of fear surrounding these kind of robots in this story, where there's a fear that these robots will take over jobs and also take over men and women, and also take over arts. So many things regarding the emotional relationships to robots and what they can do, and how that might cause an issue in our concept of humanity. I will say that the very end of the book I felt was unnecessary, and I wasn't sure I cared for the choice that Lee made at the very end, but there's something about the way Tanith Lee writes that just draws me in so much. And I can't get over how much I fell in love with it. I actually went back and I started listening to it all over again. That's how much I loved it. There is a sequel to this, though it takes place with a different character and possibly in a different timeline. And I cannot get a physical copy of this book. It is so out of print right now. I mean, it's so hard to find a copy that's not ridiculously expensive. It's hard to recommend this book because it is a romance story, and I know most of you probably don't read romance. I don't typically consider myself a romance reader, but this might be my favorite romance since Pride and Prejudice, which I know is saying a lot, right? I mean, not that I read a lot of romance, but I loved it. I loved it. Again, I have a nitpick about the very end, I almost DNF'd it several times at the beginning, but it worked for me so well. I'm so in awe of Tanith Lee, and I'm so excited to read more of her books. Let me know in the comment section below what you've read this last month. Let me know your thoughts on any of the books I talked about. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.